Hello, so today we're actually going to do a little bit of a discussion about flex play. I'm going to try and describe a little bit about how flex play kind of finds its way into different metas. We'll talk about some examples in set 15 across multiple different patches of how different options were flexible and how the set kind of got optimized to a point now where it's not super flexible. And a lot of this discussion comes from some comments that I got on my YouTube videos asking me to make a guide about flex play. I answered questions yesterday. I talked that I would do it today. But if you like my content, if you want to know more, make sure to like and subscribe because I do daily TFT guides. And then of course with set 16 around the corner, we're going to be doing all of the new info for set 16 as soon as we get any information drop, so stay tuned for that. But anyways, I want to talk a little bit about flex play in general because I got a comment asking, hey, could you do a guide on flex play? Now, this set in particular is not super flexible just by the way things have kind of worked out. There were parts that were flexible. There are still parts that are a little bit flexible, but we're going to go over it in general. One of the main reasons why this set might feel a little bit harder to play around or like keep multiple lines or options open is the addition of the fruit mechanic. Of course, we're getting toward the end of the set, and as the set progresses, the fruits are becoming more and more optimized as people are figure out more and more what's the best option, which then forces you to have particular items to support those best options and etc., which makes it feel like a little bit like you have to decide very early on exactly what you're playing around and focus and hone in on those exact units in order to bring out the most of them. So that's just something around flex play in general. But if we're talking about flex play, I did talk about it in some other guides. I thought I made a dedicated flex play guide, but I think I just talked about it intermittently in a lot of my early videos for the set that I didn't really go into it in much depth. But one thing that's really important with flex play, this is from my how to play forecast guides on my channel, right? Whenever you think about flex play, the idea is that you're trying to decide between multiple different lines that you could have open or multiple different options that you will be able to play around. When you're flexing, you're not flexing everything. It's not like you're sitting here trying to make anything work or any comp work. A lot of times you're basically deciding on a plan A and a plan B, and you try and revise your decisions to see which comp you have the best spot for, because ideally you're playing the comp that you have the best spot for. And then based on that best spot, you don't want to pivot or move out of that unless you have a really good reason to, because obviously if you're gonna just pivot out of everything and just play the uncontested line, at one point you're going to be playing such a weak line that you would have been better off just contesting a strong line, because that's just how it is, especially on different patches, which is what can make things a little bit more frustrating or difficult. So of course, I think I eventually made a guide built into one of my weekly recap type of videos, and if you want a dedicated flex guide, which we're going to talk about a little bit after, one that's still kind of relevant is playing around Volibear in flex options in your transitions into going to level 9. So that's a good option there that I will then break down and talk about a little bit more. But anyways, when you think about flexible options, one thing that you're always trying to think about, this is a little bit of an infographic that I'm using the team planner for, but you always should think of it kind of like opening and closing doors. You should always think about it of what options do I have open? Whatever items you make, whatever augments you pick, whatever you do, you're basically locking yourself out of, or not like physically locking yourself out of, but you should be mentally locking yourself out of playing around certain units, certain comps, because you're taking things that are more optimized or more focused on the units that they make sense for, right? Augments and items and power-ups and everything have to make sense with what your board is. So like I said, you're never flexing everything, but the decisions you make along the way really help you to keep certain lines open and certain lines closed, if that makes sense. So here I have examples of like different AD/ item slams that you might have something in an early game, right? Something like an IE, Infinity Edge, is very flexible. Pretty much every unit can make use of spell crit working out really well. So you have units like melee champions like Volibear and Lee Sin that do really well with IE. They obviously scale really well in doing like ults with their crits and like their first hits, especially if you have like serious slam with Volibear and stuff like that. You have lots of great opportunities to make use of the crit. Additionally, it's one of Samira's best items. She's a unit that gets a lot of base stats from Soul Fighter, so you really want to pair that with crit, and then her fruit usually gives her damage amp because she gets on the edge, which works out really well to pair with the crit. Someone like Jinx also making her ult crit is pretty powerful because she has like this huge nuke of an ult that basically hits like a large portion of the board, can absolutely decimate boards pretty easily, so scaling out the crit also works well. Other units like, for example, Ashe is a unit that you might also put here, but she's not a unit that you typically want to play with an IE because Infinity Edge on Ashe is a lot less powerful because she does mostly auto attacking, which means that you really want to scale her attack speed well, and auto attacks, which is her primary form of damage, already naturally crit. So making her spell crit, her spell just empowers her auto, so it doesn't really do all that much. It still helps, obviously, it makes like crits more consistent, it obviously ups her damage, but it's something that you kind of like think about, okay, if I'm making this item, I'm probably not going to be angling towards that unit, as a rough example, right? It's still okay on her, but I'm just giving an example. Then you have ones that are more specific, like a Hand of Justice. Hand of Justice is more of a melee focused thing, part of the power budget. It gives AD, it gives AP, sure, it gives mana regen, sure, it gives crit chance, sure, but the Omnivamp is a big part of it. And the Omnivamp, especially when you're above 50% health, when you're below 50% health, that's like really important and really powerful on a lot of melee style units. So when you're building like a melee style item like Hand of Justice, you're typically more angling towards something like a Volibear or a Lee Sin. You can still put on a backline unit, but it just won't be as effective a use of components, because you would rather, you know, maybe use the tier for a mana gen, like a proper mana gen like Shojin or Blue Buff, and maybe you want to use the glove for like a crit, like an IE, which will serve your backline a little bit better instead of giving them an Omnivamp item that doesn't help too much, maybe matchup dependent, but it's not like the idea is that you're closing doors. And then same thing with a Kraken, right? Kraken, you know, you might put on Volibear, it's like okay on him. It's not very good on Samira because she doesn't really ramp it up very easily, right? It's a lot better on like a Jinx who has built-in attack speed, or Ashe, where it's like a necessary item pretty much in all of her builds because she's like the auto attacking unit. So that's where, like, you know, these things will open up different doors or close different doors. Of course, there's things like reroll lines that get open and closed whether or not you have the reroll units. There's things like augments that can make certain comps viable or certain comps not viable based on what augment you take and how that works with your board. But basically, the way you should always look at it is, am I opening or closing doors? How do these doors remain for me to basically be able to pick between what I want to play? And that's like the main idea of flex play. So if I make something like an IE, the lines that I'll be focused on are the ones that I showed, and then if my next item ends up being a Hodge, then I narrow it down, right? Like, you can think about it like as the game progresses, what do your components, what do your augments give you? Then you'll start to say, okay, I made these items, I lock out this. Next I make a Hodge, I lock out these. Now it's like I'm playing some sort of melee fast 9 board or Volibear flex option with like a really good crit melee build. So I'm basically either playing Volibear or I'm trying to fast 9 for Lee Sin. That's the way you should look at it. And then you have the two options. If I hit econ, or if I have augments that allow me to get to level 9 to find a Lee Sin, I'll do this. If I'm stuck on a low level, then I'll play something like an edgelord luchador style of board. And basically, as the game progresses, you basically narrow down into your plan A, plan B, and that's like your flex options. Of course, something I always mention about flex play, the game always feels more flexible when units are broken. There's basically two different power budgets you can have in the game, right? You can have units that individually are really broken. Regardless of their synergy, regardless of anything else, these are units that no matter what board they're on, they're always going to be really impactful, and they're just broken units. Then there's also the traits that are really strong. There's like this balancing act of making the trait strong and making the unit strong. And sometimes you have disparities where the unit is really dependent on the traits that they have, or the board is really dependent on broken unit. So for example, 5 costs got to a point now where they're really strong. That's why there's a lot of fast 9 style boards, and people often skip playing around 4 costs. It's because single copies of these 5 costs are so powerful because there is so much power in the units themselves that it doesn't matter what the rest of your board is. If you can hit the 5 cost, you can often turn that into a win out potential. Another unit that's been strong the entire set is Cassante. Every board that Cassante's on, you don't need to play 6 Wraith for Cassante to be good. You don't need to play 6 Protector for Cassante to be good. You can fit Cassante on any board that has a free spot for a frontline unit. You will often see Cassante weasel his way in. Either he'll be +1 unit on like a Prodigy board, or it'll be a +1 unit on a Crystal Gambit board, or it'll be like a random +1 unit on some other board, or some some Wraith board or Fast 9 board, etc. It's just because Cassante, with his reviving effect, is just so powerful. It stalls for a lot of time. He can be really disruptive to like the back line. He also does a decent chunk of damage and runs around. He takes fruits really well because not only can you take proper tank fruits, because he has that revive effect, you can always give him something like the one that stuns. I forget what it's called because I blank, but you know what I mean, that he'll always proc that stun effect, which is really nice and really impactful, right? These are units where unit is really tied to their power, right? The board is really tied to the power of that unit. Another example that is the opposite is something like Yuumi, right? Yumi used to be extremely strong, but Yumi, whenever you play around her, it's very rare that you'll see somebody playing Yumi outside of a specific board that looks like this, where you play 5 Battle Academia, 5 Prodigy. The problem with Yumi is that a lot of her power scaling is in the fact of her having Battle Academia active, right? The scaling effects that she has alongside the bonus true damage she gets from her Battle Academia bonus makes things really impactful to have a certain amount of Battle Academia in, and usually 5 is like a good number for that. You could play more Battle Academia, but the other thing that really matters is Prodigy, because if this unit casts a bunch, she scales as she casts, so you want her to just have a huge amount of mana generation to scale. So usually the board that you play with her is 5 Prodigy, 5 Battle Academia. You don't see boards like 6 Bastion Yumi. You don't see boards like 6 Prodigy Yumi. You don't see boards where anything really deviates from this, because the Yumi is so reliant on these particular synergies that you kind of need it to work out. And if you don't believe me with this, right, you might look at it and you'll be like, I play this other thing. This is actually something the dev team talked about in their dev learnings when I reviewed it. They talked a lot about how Yumi is really tied to the one particular board, and it's hard to find a way for her to fit onto other boards. That's okay though, right? This is fine, because this is part of TFT in general, right? There has to be some comps where they're really flexible and you can just play anything, and there's also going to be comps where you have to just play around one particular board. I think people have the disillusion that it has to be one or the other, but it's just the way it is. Sometimes the power budget is in traits. There's been previous sets where all the units suck, but if you have all the traits active, it's actually good. There's traits where 5 doesn't matter but 7 matters, but 3 doesn't matter, stuff like that, where you want to play deep into the vertical, right? The vertical traits are really good, because imagine when you start the game of TFT. Set 16 is right around the corner. I guarantee you, if you're playing your first game of Set 16 and you don't know what any of the goddamn units do, and you just look at it and just I don't know what the fuck is going on, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at a unit that you find in your shop. You're going to say, oh, this person is a Bastion, a Battle Academia. I guess I'll just play all the Battle Academia units. And you put that shit in your team planner and you play around it. This is a very crucial step for beginner players, right? Beginner players that don't really know the optimizations, don't really know everything. You want to have the vertical traits have some level of power, because you want to be able to just click on the units that share the same synergy, put them on your board, and have something work out. Battle Academia, for example, obviously it's really good with Katarina, but some problems with sets in general, not necessarily this set, this is something that extends to all TFT. I'm not complaining about this set in this video, but across all TFT, a lot of times you'll see things where a certain vertical trait will be really strong and you just play 7 of the unit. It's that's an experience that you want to have. You want to be able to just look at it and say, oh, I found all the copies of the units. I found, the 5 piece of Exodia. I want to put them together. I want Exodia to be summoned. It's very confusing, especially for a beginner player, to be oh, what's the best board? Oh, the best board is 2 Bastion, 2 this, 2 that, 2 this, 2 that, and 3 of these, and 1 of those, and 7 of these. Imagine trying to explain that to your friend, which is the casual, large fan base of TFT, right? How are you going to explain that to somebody? It's what board did you play? Oh, I've had one of these, I had one of these, I had one of these, and one of these. Oh yeah, and this guy did pretty good as well. Those boards, obviously in an optimized way, and in a way that, from a flex standpoint, it makes sense that you basically just play anything, and you can do that. But that's not a realistic thing, right? You'll either have certain, it might be in certain cases, but a lot of times it's usually going to be interchangeable units that you can kind of slot in and out. The boards usually get optimized to predetermined states, but unless the individual units are broken, for example, if there's a certain select hand few of units that are absolutely broken, that you can play anything around them, a lot of times the traits are going to be important, and then it's a balancing act of how friendly do we want to make it for all the traits to be important, and how friendly do we want to make it to be flexible, which usually requires the units to be strong and independent of their traits. And both of them feel bad, so usually it's a mixture of both, and certain comps do one thing and certain comps do another, which is kind of how the set is now, but more or less. Let's talk about some previous examples of flex play in the set, just to give set 15 its kudos, because right now it's not very flexible, but there were points that it was flexible, and people were just kind of I don't know, I upset the whole way through. I kind of only was upset towards the end of the set. Well, actually, I was upset the whole way through, but you know what I mean, right? One example was a couple patches ago with Mighty Mech, right? Mighty Mech was extremely broken if you hit 7 Mighty Mech, right? 7 Mighty Mech was just extremely strong. It was just really obviously broken, and it got a lot of nerfs, and now it's not super relevant in the current landscape of the game. But when there was the Mighty Mech patch, there was a really common thing that you could have done, which was flexing between Mighty Mech and Akali. So with Akali, a lot of times you're just playing around Akali to just basically like scam the backline. There was a point where both of these comps were really relevant in the meta. It was like right before the mech pilot buffs, but like it was like right around the mech pilot buffs before Mighty Mech kind of took over as like the solo dolo like broken strategy, and you had both of these relevant at the same time. And a lot of times what you would do with these is you would basically hold on to similar units. This is like the cornerstone of flex play, right? If you're trying to like angle towards your plan A and your plan B, a lot of times it would be plan A Akali, and if I happen across a Yone, then I will just pivot into Mighty Mech, and I will just put Akali items on a split between the Karma and the Yone and just deal with it later. So a lot of times what would happen is you would basically hold on to the units that are really hard to find. You usually just hold on to one cost units. So if you're playing Akali, you would hold on to Kennen. If you were playing Mighty Mech, you'd hold on to Lucian. No matter what, you would basically hold on to these units. Oops, excuse me. You'd hold on to these units for most of the game, right? And then based on what you hit on your later roll down, you would then decide, do I play this one or do I play this one? And you would basically just on a level 8 roll down, basically play towards Akali, but as soon as you see a Yone, you sell everything and then you just play Mighty Mech because it was the better comp. That's basically how a lot of flex play works, is that you try and angle towards 2 different comps, you hold on to the inexpensive units because these are the ones that are going to be hard to find later, and then you just try and like make it work between the 2 of them. One thing that I wanted to talk about was a patch way earlier though. Way earlier, there was actual really reliable flex play. There was a point where Karma and Yuumi were both 2 of the best comps in the game. You played Karma with Sorks, you played Yuumi with Battle Academia. These were probably the most fun patches I had. A lot of people complained about them though. A lot of people were upset because it's like, you know, I hate Karma, I don't want to play Karma. I hate Yuumi, I don't want to play Yuumi. But there was a good portion of the game where Karma and Yuumi were both strong, and that was very early on in the set. And basically what you would do is you would flex based on what items you had a lot of the times and what your items developed into. So for example, if I'm playing around Karma, this isn't relevant right now, but it's just a little bit of a flashback so that we can talk about like what a flex patch kind of looks like, right? You would play around Karma or you would play around Yuumi, and then I also have Rise here, which we'll talk about in a second. But basically, you can slam a Jewel Gauntlet early on in the game. Jewel Gauntlet was really good on Yuumi because it would scale her, make her ult crit, and it was really good on Karma because it would make her ult crit, right? With Yuumi, you know, she's has the whole thing where she would scale and shoot all the pages, so the crit was nice. And Karma, being a Sork, you want to multiply that to be really strong, to be like a really powerful Sork item. Like she gets base AP, so then you multiply it with crit, so then she does a huge amount of damage, so it's a really good Sork item. The thing with Karma is you want to build mana generation. So a lot of times the best Karma items back when this was like in the first like couple patches of the set, like a couple months ago, you would go Shojin, JG, like Shojin to generate the mana. Blue buff wasn't that good back then, and then the JG to make her pop off, and then Yuumi, you would not want to build mana gen because she would get it from Prodigy. So basically, if you got tiers such that you can make mana generation, you can angle Karma. Or based on what your lobby is doing, you can angle Karma if it was less contested. And then if Yuumi was either less contested or you didn't get tiers, then you can build towards other Yuumi items. Base AP mattered more on Yuumi. You don't want to build an Archangels on a Sork unit because the Sork unit already has a bunch of AP. It's diminishing returns to bad item slam. So a lot of times you would build like Archangels Yuumi, or you would build Rabadon's Yuumi if you don't get dropped a tier. And you could basically make a tierless Yuumi because you don't need any tiers. You can just build her as if you're like, you know, relying solely on the Prodigy because you were playing Prodigy to give her the mana generation anyways. And often you could also build something like a Shiv. A Shiv would also work really well, and then you would be able to play around that. At the time, the only big problem was that Rise wasn't relevant. Usually, in almost every set of TFT, you'll have this situation where certain items are good on some units, certain items are not good on others, and you could basically swap between the different units in order to play flexibly. So for example, JG means that you can flex between Yuumi and Karma, and something like an Archangels or a base AP something, like an Archangels or a Rabadon Slam or anything like that, would usually indicate that you're playing towards Yumi or Rise, because Rise, he gets mana generation from his mentor bonus, so he also didn't really require mana gen, and he also, similar to Yumi, would love to have base AP. The only thing with Rise is that you wouldn't want to make a crit item because he gets crit for free because of Executioner. This is like an idea of a healthy situation, in my opinion, or at least for me, because this is like the style of gameplay that I like, something that would be really fun where you can flex between the units. When sets are really well balanced, in my opinion, of course, this is my opinion, but when sets are really fun or well balanced, this is the type of situation or the framework that you have a lot of the times. And it works the same with AD, but AP is just a little bit easier for me to explain because I'm more of an AP flex player. That's when I enjoy myself the most. An example is I can just, let's dial back even further. If we go back to one of the most renowned sets in recent history, that was set 13, which was the Arcane set. I have this video on AP flex in set 13. Do you notice that it looks very fucking similar? You know why? Because these things exist throughout all of the sets of TFT. And set 13 was really fun because you had this throughout most of the set. You had Heimerdinger, Silco, and Zoe in that set. You had Heimerdinger, who was basically the same as Yumi, like pretty much exactly, so you'd build them similar to a Yumi. Nashor was different back then, don't worry about it. Then you have Silco, who gained a lot of AP, and then you have a Sork, which was like the Zoe, which is basically like Sorks of this set. Just with a different icon, and you would basically just decide based on what items you had, if you were building certain mana items or certain other items, which of the units you would basically play around. And that's something that made it really healthy because you can basically flex between the different lines, and then you would do similar to how I showed here. You would just hold on to the auxiliary units. Something that made this set a little bit harder though is that the auxiliary units were a little bit difficult. So if you really wanted to, on those earlier patches, flex between Karma and Yumi, it was a little bit difficult because for Yumi you'd have to hold this, and then for Karma, you'd have to hold these guys. So then your bench is really full with a lot of bullshit. Like you're holding on to a lot of stuff in order to allow you to play flexibly, which is what made it like, even when there were flexible patches, it felt a little bit awkward. But at the same time, both these comps, they played Cassante. So you had like that little shared synergy where on your roll down, you can basically hold Cassante and play around either of them. In some cases, you can even hold on to a Leona because you can play like the Swain for Sorks, and you could have played Leona intermittently between two of the boards. But these are just some extra options of like some flex play and some ideas behind it. Now, one thing that I want to mention, this set now, one of the more flexible lines you can play around is Bastions. Bastions is an example of something where it does have a really high cap, but there is a lot of flexible options around it. This is a little bit different than what I was describing. This is more like you just play into a frontline synergy and you basically interchange the backline units. In terms of 5 costs, a lot of times you will see people play Twisted Fate and Seraphine, but at the same time, you can also play a Gwen. Gwen can hold items pretty well, and she can be like, Seraphine obviously is a little bit better because of fruit optimizations. Gwen doesn't have good fruits most of the time. Like her fruits are pretty shit, so Seraphine just does more damage because after buffs with Mage and with Star Guardian active, she's a little bit better than like playing a Gwen. But it is to say that you have flexible options here. Additionally, you could also play around 4 costs with this board. One thing I talk about a lot is playing around Jinx and Volibear. This is an example of a way that you can use an intermittent step in your journey to going to Fast 9. You can roll really deep and you can play around the Volibear, and you can just put all of your attack speed and AD items on the Jinx. You don't have a good AP item holder, but with this type of setup, you usually would angle towards more AD items because you know that like you would gauge based on the way the game is going whether or not you'll be able to make it to level 9 or not. So if you know that you're intending to roll a lot on level 8, then you can play a lot deeper into these particular lines. A video that I had, you can just look it up. I'll link it in the description, hopefully, if I remember to. But this was a guide that I made a couple weeks ago. I think it was like around 2 weeks ago. I basically described the same thing, right? You can even play Samira and get more edgelords in, but there was like a way of flexing around it. And then I even went through part of the VOD review on my VOD channel. That's in the description. You can just check it out. I think it's even the most recent one because I didn't post many videos after that on the VOD channel where I actually do this. I make AD items. I play Bastions. I play around Volibear. I roll really deep for the Volibear. I make items that are flexible that I can work on the Volibear, right? So I made the Hodge, the IE, and then eventually, I don't know where it is. Eventually, I pivot out of it. I started the game off, I played like around Jinx, I played this is a different setup, but I played Jinx, Volibear in a different game, and then eventually I moved these on to Twisted Fate, and I changed my whole board, and then I played the Seraphine, and I had the adaptive helm, and everything kind of worked out a little bit later. these are examples of ways you can be a little bit flexible, because this Bastion front line is so reliable and so strong, and also has a lot of different synergies, right? If you hit the Braum, you can activate Luchador. Even if you don't have the Braum, you could play 4 Bastion, and you can play these two as a sniper variation in the back line, right? I cover this all in the other video, like I said. That's why I'm going through it a little bit fast. You have Edgelord for the Volibear. You can even play Battle Academia in some cases, but not super recommended. And then, of course, you have Sork that you can easily slot in the Gwen. You have good opportunities to just, like, interchange a lot of the units. And then obviously if you hit the 5 cost, which you have a wide variety of 5 costs that are playable with this line, if you hit some of them that work, right, this one works, 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 and even Lee Sin in some case, if you have melee items, doesn't matter that you don't have Juggernaut in, you can still play the Lee Sin and just add a Juggernaut and just play this setup, right? You can just like play this with a Mundo, right, and hold your AD items if you have them. But you have a lot of opportunity to interchange these units, which on a level 8 roll down, you might just high roll 1 copy of them. Sometimes you just find a Twisted Fate on level 8. That way, now you're stable with Twisted Fate, 6 Bastion, and then some other unit, either Jinx or Volibear, that you can stabilize around. That's kind of the nature of how Flex Play kind of worked out. One thing I will mention is a lot like with fruits. A big reason, like I mentioned before, is the fruits kind of lock out certain comms. I remember we were talking a little bit about like item slams and how you can play around different units. The item slams matter a lot because certain fruits just lock out certain items, if that makes sense. Something that you could do in the past to be really flexible is you could just make generic items. A lot of times generic items are usually like utility items, so either things that apply Shred Sunder or things that apply anti-heal. Something you can do early game a lot of the time was you can just make Sunfire. Sunfire was a decent early game item. It wasn't a good tank item, but it's a decent early game item that you can just play around, and it gives anti-heal, so you can't go wrong, right? Whether you're playing AP, AD, no matter what you're playing, it's like, hey, I'm making a utility item that makes it so my opponent doesn't get as much healing. This is something I could just make, and then I can decide what I'm playing later, because Flex Play is all about like keeping doors open and postponing that decision until later. And then when you have more information, more augments, more items, and you can see what actually is going to work out, then you can hone in on the exact comms to optimize and what you want to actually play. Stuff like this doesn't work anymore. Jinx, a couple patches, right? Making a Last Whisper wasn't very great on Jinx. A couple patches ago, before, like, you know, Gather Force was really broken, or everybody kind of played Gather Force, they discovered that it was really broken. A lot of times, like, making a Last Whisper on Jinx was really bad. And what you'd normally play is, like, one of the fruits that gives you the Shred Sunder, right? It was a Sky Piercer, right? Sky Piercer Jinx was a very common occurrence a couple patches ago. And what that would mean is that the same way that we showed, like, that breakdown of, like, which people are you trying to play around, if you made certain items like Last Whisper, you then wouldn't be able to take that fruit, and your build path would change. One example currently on the current patch is something like Twisted Fate. With Twisted Fate, you basically never want to be making anti-heal, and you never want to be making Shred Sunder. Why is that? Because if you're angling towards Twisted Fate, which is one of the highest cap comps in the game, so most of the time you're angling towards it, what ends up happening is you run yourself into a really bad spot, because there is the Noxious Trap. Noxious Trap, right? Where you get Burn, Wound, Shred, and Sunder on the fruit itself. The reason this is so potent is because when you're playing around these boards, right, especially like these fast 9 or these high cap boards, you want to have items to itemize your main damage dealers. You want to have items for a Lee Sin if you're playing Lee Sin. You want to have items for a Seraphine and a Twisted Fate if you're playing these units. Using the components to make utility items, these items are not good damage items. They're not good tank items, right? Sunfire, I said, it's good early game. It's not good late game. Why? Because it's not better than a regular tank item. The tank effects of this item are very little. It gives you a little bit of armor, and it gives you some percentage max health. Other items give you way more stats and way more bonus effects that help you to stay alive. This is mostly just for like the effect of it, the burning and the wounding. Same with a Last Whisper. Last Whisper, obviously, it has some synergies with crit builds because it's a crit glove item, and red buff obviously gives a bunch of attack speed, which can be good, but all in all, relative to other damage items, they are not that good. So the reason that Noxious Trap forces your hand a lot is because you'd rather make pure damage items. So now you're basically foregoing making these utility items, which could matter a lot, especially if you're going up against another Bastion board. If you're going up against a melee carry, you just won't be able to kill anything. Like, try and kill Katarina without anti-heal. Good luck, you know what I mean? So it's like, you can't make those decisions because you're basically saying to yourself, I'm going to do this win out potential with these fast 9 boards. And you could say, okay, well, why don't I just take a different fruit on Twisted Fate? I'll make the utility items. Then your Twisted Fate isn't going to hit very hard. He's going to hit like a noodle. And additionally, the problem is that with these types of boards, especially if you're going for these fast 9 boards, you need to be win out potential, right? You need to be as optimized as possible. If you don't have good tank items and you don't have good damage items, then it doesn't function as a comp, because you're going to make it to level 9. You're going to have very low HP because you have to sack, you have to manage your econ. Like, unless you're high rolling and you're 100 HP level 9, you're just winning the lobby because you're smurfing. Most of the time, you're going to be level 9. You're going to have like 10 HP. And if you lose a single round, you're just dead. So if you don't have proper damage items and proper tank items and proper like items on all of your 5 costs, you're in a bad spot. So that's why something like this became a really necessary optimization, because being able to use your components for proper tank and damage items made it really broken. Now obviously, I'm giving a Noxious Trap example. There's a lot of situations like these where the particular fruit that you're having has to be optimized with the items in order to compete with a lot of these boards. And that's just the nature of the set progressing, which is what makes it feel a lot less flexible and makes it harder to flex in general. Because if you don't have the particular set of components, items, and fruit that all synergizes together, what can end up happening is your board will just be inherently weaker than somebody else's who is optimized for it. It's not necessarily that the fruit itself is so broken that the fruit is like, you know, the fruit has to be nerfed, it's broken, it's like the best thing on the unit. It's the fact that if you optimize your items to pair with the fruit, then it is absolutely broken and you don't have another option. If you try and make your items flexible to flex around multiple different fruits, you're just going to be inherently weaker than somebody who rolls for a specific fruit with specific items that work really well with it. Examples are stuff like Gather Force. This became Jinx's best fruit. It does a shit ton of damage. It gives her a bunch of AD, but a lot of it you would make your build path with the Gather Force in mind. Similarly, if you're building Noxious on either Twisted Fate or Malzahar, that's another thing that factors in. So a lot of times your boards are going to be inherently weaker. That's why I mentioned before, remember when I talked about the Volibear board? I said 6 Bastion, and I said it's kind of like an in-between step. Well, yeah, because like usually if you're playing this board, you're using it as an in-between step because you're not making Shred Sunder or Anti-Heal or anything else. A lot of times you might try and roll Sky Piercer on Jinx just to give yourself Shred Sunder, but you don't have Anti-Heal. But a lot of times, like, you know, you might play this and then, you know, level 8, you might win a couple rounds, you might be stable, but until you hit somebody with Noxious Trap, eventually, you know, you're going to have a hard time chewing through other Bastion boards. You're going to have a hard time chewing through other Anti-Heal boards because you're building your items towards that Twisted Fate line. And then obviously, if you decide to just play around this and then you build Shred Sunder Anti-Heal, then you're making it so that you don't have access to that optimization. If you make it to level 9, you can't pivot into all of those 5 costs because your items aren't going to be as strong. You're just going to be a weaker variation of somebody else in your lobby who optimized for it. And that's kind of what ends up happening. Now, obviously, like I said, there are flex options a little bit. I talk about it in the other video with it. But that's kind of what kind of the set kind of became, which is just a nature of like the pairing of like the way units kind of fell in their puzzle pieces as they kind of got buffed and adjusted as things went on. But also just by nature of the mechanic itself, kind of forcing the hand a little bit in that being able to reroll the fruits as well as like plan for fruit on unit. Made it that it's a little bit awkward to have like those open options. So what do you do on the current patch? Well, on the current patch, because it's later in the set, a lot of things are a little bit more optimized. I'll probably do a last little like best comps guide tomorrow. I said that I would do this one today, so it's gonna be a little bit later in the week, but it's fine. But a lot of times, like, you know, you're angling towards the comp from very early on in the game. You can keep a couple lines open with more flexible items, similar to how I was talking about in some of these examples earlier on in the video. But most of the time, you're pretty clear on what you're playing and why you're playing it. And a lot of times it's very augment dependent as well, and spot dependent, right? A lot of things have insane win out potential. So a lot of times, you know, people will be playing Ashe, where if they just hit critical mass, fast, they win out for free. People will be playing Fast 9, where if they hit the 5 cost, either the Juggernaut Lee Sin variation or the Bastion Seraphine variation, they'll just hit everything and they'll just win out with that type of board anyways. So because there's these heavy win out comps that are also a little bit more risky, the main thing that you're trying to do is navigate through that based on your spot. If you have a very obvious Soul Fighter spot, for example, you know that you're probably not going to win the game unless something crazy happens, but you're trying to farm like a top 4, right? Your job is to try and farm in between, and that's where the flex play comes into it, right? If you don't have a clear spot to go for a win out comp or to go for a reroll comp, if you don't have a reroll comp that you can commit to early, a lot of times you're trying to flex between some of the other units. Maybe play Star Guardian, maybe play Samira, Soul Fighter, maybe play like the Jinx Volibear board that I talked about. And in those regards, then you're trying to optimize for these weaker variations that probably won't win against one of the level 9 boards, but what you're hoping to do is to be strong enough and stable enough that you save HP, and then all the level 9 players, you know, they can't all win the game. They're all going to be level 9 with like 10 HP or something. They'll all kill each other else off, and then you'll go get like a second or a third. That's kind of like the way the patch kind of goes. So it's not really as much flexing as more as like evaluating your spot, seeing if you have a good spot to play for a win out, and if you don't, trying to salvage it to get the maximum placement that you can. And usually pivoting off of a Fast 9 line or one of those other lines or pivoting no matter what you're playing. Like the pivot options are usually just for you deciding whether or not the risk is worth it. Because obviously, you know, you can just win out if things go right, but usually evaluating your spot to decide whether or not you have that win out spot, and then try and make things do with that. But anyways, that was a little bit of a flex guide. Like I said, I'm going to link this video, which is the Volibear flex one. I think this one's probably the most important flex guide-ish thing on the current patch. And then, of course, I mentioned it in a lot of my other videos, like this is the how to play 4 cost guides, where I talk a little bit about it, or I talk about it in more detail, but I also mentioned it across multiple of the other videos. I think I just didn't make a dedicated flex guide because it didn't make a lot of sense this current set. And then there's also a guide on contesting somewhere later in somewhere on my contest. Yeah, there's like a playing contested line that I made around 2 months ago. This one also talks a little bit about flex play. This gives a better idea of when and why you should pivot. If you're looking for like, you know, flex and pivoting goes hand in hand. But if you're trying to think of like, when should I like duck out of town and like skip to a different comp, this is a great example of like giving you like a resource of, okay, these are the criteria for when I should pivot or when I shouldn't pivot. But anyways, hopefully that was informative and fun. I tried my best to make it as, like, you know, nice as possible and talk a little bit about the history of it and the reasons for it and the reasons why, and make it informative. If you like that content, hopefully it was enjoyable. Hopefully I answered the question to the one chatter / YouTube commenter that asked about it. And hopefully that gave you like a little bit of a working playroom that you can use in your current games. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see you. Bye-bye.